Hello and welcome to the DW debate at the World Economic Forum. To our viewers watching us from home, we're coming to you from the most visited city in Africa, Cape Town. My name is Edith Kimani. Now, according to UN figures, by the year 2050, every 2 out of 4 people will be African. Now, that's quite staggering when you think about it. Does that then mean that if the population is going to quadruple here, that our data will also quadruple? And what does that mean for the future of data on the continent? This morning, we're asking the question, is data Africa's new oil? And I'm going to be helped to answer that by my esteemed panel. And I'm going to be introducing them now. I'm joined by Sylvia Makario on my extreme right. She's the head of Geospatial Technologies and the co-founder of Hepta Analytics based in Kenya. We're also joined by Mr. Alex Liu, who is a managing partner and chairman at AT Kearney. If you've been to the World Economic Forum a few times, you might have seen his face. On my right, my immediate right, is Mr. Murat Sönmez. He is the managing director and the head for the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution right here at the World Economic Forum. So our host and also doubling up as a panel member. Thank you. And last but not least, Frans, who is the co-founder and chief executive officer at DataProphet, based here in South Africa. Thank you all for joining us. So, Murat, let me start with you. We're asking the question, is data Africa's new oil? Why that comparison? Is it even a fair one?
I would go a step further and say data is the oxygen.
Oxygen? For
the Fourth Industrial Revolution, because if you look at the developments in artificial intelligence, particularly around 2016, with very little data, we have demonstrated that we can crack potentially some of the most difficult challenges we face today, from increasing agriculture yields, reducing energy consumption, improving congestion, and maybe accelerate the cure for cancer. And data is the source for a lot of these potential developments. So in our view, in my view, data is the oil. It's probably the oxygen for the Fourth Industrial Revolution, and there's a huge potential, as you said, in Africa.
We're talking about potential, but Frans, you're someone who's actually already harnessing the power of data. Can you talk to me about what you do at DataProphet?
Absolutely. So a lot of the work that we do at DataProphet focuses on analyzing manufacturing data, which is a really interesting field when you look at the amount of data created, because manufacturing as a sector is in fact the sector that produces the most amount of data, right? But within the African context, in fact, the way, or rather who we serve, is largely manufacturing hubs across the world served from Africa, right?
Sylvia, you're also doing something similar at Hepta Analytics.
Correct.
And there's an interesting article you wrote about how data is already helping us fight climate change in Africa.
Correct. So at Hepta Analytics, what we are focusing on, we've worked with the Rwandan government and most particularly the Agricultural Ministry in harnessing their data in collaboration with satellite imageries to ensure that they have the correct information on where particular crops are being planted. So for climate change, that then the data helps countries or organizations determine when to plant and when not to plant, therefore avoiding waste. So in that manner, you're trying to tackle the whole idea of climate change and ensuring that you transcend that by using data to make sure you're making better decisions at the right time.
So if on the hierarchy of needs, data and the human touch, which comes first? Murat, that's for you.
For me?
Yeah.
I think they go together, because with data we can really have human-centric solutions. And data is not just coming from people. Obviously it's important, but there's a potential, as we heard before, to harness data from things as well. And if you combine things data, environment data, lifestyle data, personal data, we can truly create a data economy that benefits the people of Africa, and also create the environment for startups and create opportunities for young people to get into new fields.
Alex, I want to come to you now because we're talking in the context of Africa. These startups, we're in one of the biggest hubs right now, but these tech initiatives are often limited to either city or enterprise level. How do we make sure that Africa as a whole is enjoying the benefits?
Well, I mean, I think I would take first Murat's provocation maybe a bit further. I mean, data is not only Africa's oil and oxygen, but also the global oil and oxygen, and therefore learning lessons from around the world on how data can be applied analytically with software to solve some of the problems that my colleagues here on the panel are working on, whether it's food tech or fintech, providing better, safe, and secure cities and the like. So the applications of taking data and applying it in the African context, the rural mix, the country diversity, et cetera, is very important. I think the issue outside of the leapfrogging potential is the problem and the paranoia of maybe falling behind. Because I would say if you think about the data as a strategic asset, just like oil and oxygen, you've got to create it, you've got to collect it, and you've got to protect it. And if data is like oil, what would you do if someone was taking your oil every day, selling it back to you, and you couldn't protect it, you couldn't protect the pipes? And I think that's the issue for Africa to unlock the potential. It's not just finding the right best applications for the future, learning from the world, having the public-private partnerships that Murat talked about, but also having a sensible data framework. What are the rules? Who owns the data? Who decides who owns the data? Who prices the data? Who collects the data? Where do you store it safely and in a safe environment? And I think we can come to that later. I think there's some areas to debottleneck for Africa that allows more cross-border trade, clear rules on data, authenticating customers and suppliers and transactions and the like. So there's a little bit of, on this topic, I think there's two parts of my brain, the optimism, and there's also, boy, there's a lot of things that need to change in order to take advantage of some of these applications.
Okay, so let me stay with you. You're saying we need just a little bit of skepticism when it comes to the issue of data. At the moment, are we applying that balance correctly?
I think we need more than skepticism. I think a fair amount of paranoia. You know, data is a weapon. And if you don't think you own the data now, someone else owns it. And if you don't collect it and protect it, someone already has it. Just this past week, we talked about Google identifying, obviously they have a conflict of interest in some sense. They're saying iPhone for 2 years had a malware that was spying on you. Right? We have all the sort of global trade issues regarding sort of who's spying on who in terms of equipment in the technology of the fourth industrial revolution. I think Facebook just had to pay a $200 million fine for allowing bad players to sort of violate child privacy laws. So the intrusion of data is borderless. And some of our laws are within countries, and there's 54 countries here in Africa. And as I looked at the figures in 2019, of the 54 countries, only 24 have any form of formal data legislation in terms of frameworks for how to create, collect, and protect it. And the rest either have draft legislation, no legislation, or no data. So it's not skepticism, it's sort of we have to get our act together as a continent in the context of the free trade agreement and the spirit of collaboration to be able to enable this cross-border vision, intra-regional bloc that everyone wants to create the jobs and the like.
All right, Sylvia, I want to come to you because we're saying that data is ambient, and we've actually gone as far as say that it is the oxygen of the fourth industrial revolution. But how do you make something valuable that everyone has access to?
Thank you. So currently, as we look at it from the Hepta analytics perspective, is in the African continent, and most particularly African governments, we have a lot of legacy technologies that do not have the potential to harness the data that is required for them to make valuable and quality decisions. So currently, what we advise anybody who wants to get into that space to the point where they're going to analyze the data is, do you want to have the infrastructure that is going to harness this data? So we have to start with the infrastructure that is going to enable you to acquire the kind of data you're going to analyze. At the end of the day, then, from that point is then when you decide which kind of insights you're going to draw for you to make the kind of decisions you want to make.
So, Murat, let's come to you because Sylvia has already touched on some of the challenges. In your mind, what are the big ones for Africa when it comes to collection and management and storage of data?
Now, I want to comment on what Alex said. And I agree with your paranoia because there is a risk that nations or continents that generate data and put it to potential good use for their citizens and countries using artificial intelligence and deep learning will take off. And there is a risk that those countries who have the data but cannot harness it because of lack of technology or don't have the data will be forever left behind. So we will see a world where those countries will jump forward and others will have the potential of permanently falling behind. So that's the opportunity and the challenge we have. So the idea is to really create the infrastructure to generate data, and this is where technologies like 5G and Internet of Things come into play. But I think it needs to be a national strategy, not left to individual companies because it's too big. And if we can instrument the fields, if we can instrument the oceans, we can collect a lot of data and improve agriculture, as I mentioned, oceans, and health. And in terms of who owns the data, who makes money out of it, if you look at some of the platform companies, their market valuations are bigger than the GDPs of all African countries. So there's value in data. The question is, how do we turn that into value for the owners of the data, who gets to decide it? So we have a theory. It was actually inspired by will.i.am, the musician.
Oh, wow.
And he's
Very
on our...
urban here.
Yes, so we work with cool people, as you see on the panel as well. And he said, Murat, look, anytime somebody uses my music, I get residual value out of it. Why can't we do it for data?
Okay, we'll come to that idea in just a short second, but everyone seems to be talking about infrastructure.
Yep.
Frans, do you feel that the South African government is supporting you in this sector, or are you by yourself?
It's from a data infrastructure component, it's quite interesting, especially kind of coming out of an African context, in the sense that all of our data processing is actually offshore, right? We don't have the necessary infrastructure. We've got the necessary infrastructure to move data, but not actually process it. And so when you look at the big data servers, it's Amazon with their web servers, it's Azure within Microsoft, none of those centers are in Africa yet, right? Gradually that's beginning to change, and as of the beginning of this year, in fact, Microsoft has begun to build data centers, but even then, it's very much focused within South Africa and not within a broader African context, right? And that makes almost Africa more at risk when it comes to data, right? Because we have to move our data offshore to process it.
So how do we convert ourselves in this virtual order from being raw data producers to being market leaders potentially?
It's a difficult thing, right? The first one, and I agree with Sylvia in her statement a bit earlier, whereby we actually need to implement the infrastructure that creates a lot of the data. And right now we're working off older infrastructure which isn't producing the data in a manner that is set up for good processing. And then once you've created that, almost those pipes, right? Or let's talk about within the oil analogy, you want to create the extraction of oil from the ground, although this is, in this context, the extraction of data. Then you've created the demand for the refinery, which are these processing centers, right?
Yeah.
I was going to say, I mean, there is a real-world example that's being rolled out even yesterday by the Regional Business Council of the World Economic Forum, which is called the Africa Growth Platform. So it takes Murat's point about taking a global platform that small and medium business and entrepreneurs in Africa, young and old, millennials and Generation Z or older than that, like me, can actually enable collaboration, get some of the best tools and the like. It's tight, and the founders of this consortium are very intriguing. You've got Alibaba, Zenith Bank. We're very lucky to be a part of it as well, Dahlberg, and a few others that I don't have the names right here. But I mean, it's very exciting, and that's something that government, public-private partnerships can build a platform to enable the jobs and also protect and nurture the small and medium sector, which I think is the heartbeat of any economy, but especially for Africa, since you don't have the global export economics that East Asia had 20 years ago. It's really got to be Africa for Africa, and this type of platform, taking the best of the technologies and the best energies of entrepreneurs like here, can make it work. That's a great example. I think it's real time.
But I mean, at the moment, those platforms don't exist. So the real question, Murat, is where is our data? Who has it? And what are they doing with it?
There's not much data at the moment. It needs to be extracted and collected. And it's an opportunity. And I think data and infrastructure should be treated as electricity, roads, and healthcare, like high priority strategic infrastructure for the government. So the potential is there. Data is locked up. There's not much of it. And that's the huge upside. And there's also the downside risk. And if we don't do it, small, medium enterprises won't be able to keep up. And that will create a downhill trend. So the opportunity is there. The time is now. And I share Alex's enthusiasm based on our discussions here with the South African government officials and other African government officials. They're willing to take the first steps and really create that policy framework to enable it.
Yeah.
Almost jumping in there, I agree entirely with the idea that data predominantly right now is locked up. It sits in storage. It hasn't been built to be used by data processors, right? It's been built for a compliance perspective, right?
How do you mean?
So let's take, say, the insurance industry. As an insurance company, I need to report to some governing body as to my liability, right? I'm going to collect just the set of data that is required to answer that question, and I'm going to store it in that data warehouse without any context of the people that are potentially enrolled on my insurance product, right? And that's how I've designed my data infrastructure. I haven't designed it to allow, say, kind of other enterprises or even within my own enterprise to consider how I can use this data to create further value, right? I've just looked at it from a reporting perspective. And it's almost, when you look at data infrastructure, you can see two mindsets. And really there's an older one which centers on, we're going to rest this data, we're going to store it, you can always go and reference it, but it's not set up to interact with simply. And then there's a shifting mindset towards actually data can continuously create value if you build it in a manner where you can kind of give it the necessary context. You can kind of think a little bit wider than just the narrow compliance questions you need to answer.
So then that brings me back to Murat and this idea that you have of having a central place where people can value and trade data.
Yeah, so our thesis is that if you treat data as a commodity, much like oil, and allow for people to share their data or sell their data, the question is how do you value the thing because it doesn't have built-in value. So we said, what if we, again, taking off from Will.i.am's point, we said, how do we create value, assign value to data when it doesn't have intrinsic value? So we said, how do you value coffee or oil or tea or any minerals? There's a system called commodity exchanges. So we said, what if we trade data? Well, you cannot trade data because of privacy and volume. So we said, can we create an alternative, kind of a reference? And here, technologies like blockchain come in handy. We can create a token exchange. So the idea is, let me give you an example. South Africa, an African continent, has a large gene pool, diverse. And if we can collect everybody's genetic data, I think most of us would volunteer to give it free of charge for curing cancer. But if somebody wants to build a medicine, I want to have my consent asked for, and I'm paid. So if you can tag the data, and I can say, if I can put on my data, like music, anyone wanting to use it for cancer research can use it forever. I don't want any money, but for other purposes, ask for my consent. We can actually do that technically. So when somebody launches a cancer research application, I'm thinking about an app store that is certified, the data makes itself available. But if it's for drug discovery, I get notified. I say you can use it for 6 months. And then because my data is traded at an exchange using a proxy, I get paid the value for that purpose, and it goes up and down. And they can trace it back to me, so I get paid. And the finance ministers are happy because they can tax that transaction. So it creates an equitable platform, and it benefits the owners of the data, not just the platform companies. And it also allows for startups to come in and harness the power of data, and that can create a huge wave of innovation and employment opportunities for the young people.
I have to say I really like that idea, but you're talking about leveraging privacy for data to be used, in a bigger context of perhaps even curing cancer. But Sylvia, I have to ask, are we prepared for this? I mean, I've heard it said that if the challenge for small data was privacy, then the challenge for big data is safeguarding our free will. That the predictive technology will be so good that I wouldn't even know if my thoughts are mine.
I don't think we are yet ready for that. We haven't gotten to that level yet. There are countries that are ready to embrace that, but the general feeling of the population is, you're using my data to manipulate me. And that is the general feeling we have as a population worldwide. And to get to the point where we trust that someone is going to use our data to benefit us, then we have to get to a point where we trust whoever owns our data, and they have to show us. We obviously have different organizations having policy and regulation that you have to take. Sometimes you just take that policy and just stick without reading what you're sharing. Right. You just say, the policy is multiple pages, could be 100 pages. You don't end up reading all those. You never know whether you sold your soul. So how do you ensure that you have very minimal pages to read to understand that your data is not going to be manipulated or be used against you? Okay,
so this is basically like us accepting cookies, or at least I used to accept cookies long before I knew what they were. To be honest, I'm still not sure I know what cookies are. But when we talk about, this concept of big data, digital literacy comes into play. For a population of Africans who are sometimes trying to get onto the grid, sometimes not literate, how do you bring them onto the table in a fair way, Alex?
Well, I mean, you put your finger on some key structural issues in Africa, which is the digital divide. So on the one hand, there is part of the population that has access to global internet platforms and high speed and mobile, et cetera, and there's a large portion that has no access. So if you want people to opt in on some of the business models that Murat commented on, and provide their data and monetize it and prioritize it, you have a fundamental mismatch right now in terms of the availability of all the information that could be possible. I think, let me comment a bit also on this theme that is coming through here, which is the tension between data, if it's available to all the population, and the personalization options. You want better service, they know what you need, the company can provide with AI techniques a better and more adaptive product line and service experience. And the other hand, privacy. Right? So do you opt in, do people opt you in, and the like? Because it has huge implications for not only your day-to-day life, but also just democracy itself, right? In my country, we talk about intrusion of the voter populations. If you don't have the access, how do you know, and you have global players who don't have the best intentions, they know more about your voter population in a democracy than the countries do.
I mean, it happens.
So that's a big issue for, I think you said, availability of the services.
Right. No, I was just saying that real-time examples, Cambridge Analytica and their involvement in Kenya, we saw how that could work out. So this is obviously a very scary concept. Are we putting enough thought into this as governments, Frans? Do you feel that, for example, SADC as a region is sitting down and collectively thinking about this issue?
Well, we're seeing some initial policy being drafted. I mean, within the context of South Africa, we see the POPI Act, which shares a lot in common within the context of GDPR, and it's gradually being implemented. Are we moving quick enough is always the question, right, in the implementation of policies like that. And, it's generally the sense that it's not yet kind of been well implemented, et cetera, or it's in the process rather. And I think that's a general sentiment shared across kind of the broader African region, is that while we know what we need to do, it's a matter of seeing it implemented. Right?
So let me come back to you. What can we do at this table, you yourself, to push or to increase the speed of change?
It's a lot of the forums that we engage with are centered on the data and the data infrastructure, right? And we come more from, obviously, the commercial side of everything. So we talk to, and when we talk in forums, we encourage just the kind of good data security practice, various different elements like that, right? But for us, almost as a very small company within the South African space, it is difficult for us to petition change within the space any more than we can just talk in forums and just elevate it to front of mind type conversations. Right?
So we've been talking about the examples of how data can go right. But what happens when we get it wrong, when the analytics are not correct? What happens, for example, Sylvia, when your big machines lean more towards one metric and undervalue another? Can we trust that data?
That's a very good question. Obviously, the machines are created by the statistical models, which are the machines, are created by humans. And humans can decide to be evil or nice. So how ethical a person is also comes into play in creating these statistical models that learn over time, and then they're the ones who decide what target advert you're going to get on your feed, or which kind of information is going to be showed on your feed. So it depends on who is creating that machine and what their intent is. At the end of the day, it's the person creating the machine.
So how do we judge the ethics of a machine that's been built by an unethical person?
Before I get to that, I want to comment on policy. I think the danger we have is to create policies that are backward-looking and punitive, which doesn't work, because if you get caught, you pay. But the opportunity is to be forward-looking and enabling. And there are technologies that we can use to enforce that the data is used for the permitted use case, as I mentioned, like blockchain, smart contracts. Going back to ethics, the question is whose ethics? I mean, within South Africa, I don't know if we can come up with a common ethics framework, let alone around the world. And in the case of machine learning and artificial intelligence, the people are not writing the algorithm, it's being derived from the data. So to make sure that the data is not biased, it's coming from trusted source is key. And we have a concept, and right now, we cannot control the algorithms. They're developed by, and it's called the black box AI problem, and a lot of money is being spent on transparency. So we said, how do we prevent bad stuff from happening? Then we looked around and we saw electricity. If you touch electric wires, you die. But what made electricity safe is the circuit breaker. It was insurance companies of America that got fed up by paying for fire damages in the early 20th century. They said, well, we need to enforce this protocol. They created underwriter laboratories, and the insurers told the companies, if you don't use underwriter laboratories, UL certified circuit breakers, we're not going to insure you. So it was a market force that gave us safe electricity. So we have an initiative at our center to create an equivalent. We call it the ethics switch. By embedding ethics code into these smart devices, it's quite technical, it can be done. And we think that's a good way to prevent bad things from happening. And in this case, every country can define their ethics rules. And we ask for the manufacturers to conform to that. And we can use insurance mechanism to enforce that. So that work is underway. It's not solved, but it's a fundamental question, is how do we ensure that we have an ethical world, and whose ethics, and how do we enforce that?
Yeah. Frans, to what extent do you think about this when you're implementing these machines in your world?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, when it comes down to ethics, there's an interesting debate going on as to whether the human in the process, the person developing that algorithm, right, should be subscribing to something similar to the Hippocratic Oath, right? Whether they should take it upon themselves to be ethical through that. And almost, it's a little bit nerve-wracking from my perspective, because it's wonderful that data science as a science has been been made very widely available through online resources. But I think there should be some recognition as to the level of influence that those data scientists have upon society, right? And almost go so far as to say there should be some, coming back to the electricity analogy, it's the circuit breaker, but it's also the certified electrician, right? I am not a certified electrician. I cannot install plug points in my own place, right? But I can work with data, and in fact, anyone can work with data and influence outcomes, right? So I'd like to see almost something come from the perspective of just reminding the data practitioner, or in them subscribing to something to say, the work that you do is influential on other people's lives.
Yeah,
I was just going to add, there will always be bad actors, and even if you have an ethics-based algorithm, someone can try to intrude that and influence it. So I think there needs to be an equal dose of not only forward-looking protection, but also current protection. Right? Everyone has seen the statistics about cybercrime, supply chain intrusions and malware, and everyone's being looked on by everyone else. So I think one suggestion for the groups and audiences here at the WEF is having a common policy framework on cybersecurity and a commitment to that, because if you can't protect your data, you're not going to be able to do all the great things in a trusted way, as you point out, for the future and for the benefit of the citizens.
Okay, so as we're looking at the data value chain, at the moment we're saying that the custodians are certainly not in Africa, the ones who are writing the algorithms, the ones who are influencing us, as it were. So how big is the threat of digital colonization for Africa in the future? Yeah, Alex?
Well, I mean, I think it's a danger. I mean, there are very powerful entities with information, with data scientists, with engineers that are thinking about how to game the system and game countries and game markets. So I think, we have to be on sort of red alert to be able to protect, what you want to do proactively in the industry and in the economy.
Okay.
And it's not just a threat for Africa. If you look at platform companies, they're mostly in the United States and in China and nowhere else. So it is a global challenge. And so if you don't act now, I think we may be at a point where it may be too late.
And how do we start acting as individuals, not even as government?
Well, I think government policy plays a key role. Individuals will not be able to do much unless we have the infrastructure to make it happen. On our part, we're working with several African governments to open a center here in South Africa and in Rwanda to accelerate the policy making. And somebody asked me if this was another think tank. And I said, we need to be a do tank. We just need to put our heads down and get going and try these new frameworks. So now is the time to take action. And it requires, as Alex mentioned, public-private collaboration. We need to have academia. We need to have faith leaders. We need to have startups, the young generation, to be part of the solution. But we just need to roll up our sleeves and start working on these issues.
Okay, we have just about 13 minutes left for this discussion, so I want to ask the question I started with. Murat, do you think that data is Africa's new oil?
Yes, it is. And as I said, I would go a step forward, and it's the oxygen for Africa. And the potential is there. As you said, the population is there, the willingness is there, the opportunity is there. And I see the willingness from the political leaders and the business community to take advantage of that.
And if it is indeed the new oil, how does Africa protect itself from another resource curse?
Again, it's a matter of, as Alex mentioned, who gets to collect it, who gets it to put to good use. And if you look at around the world, no country has an advantage. We're at the starting point. So nobody has this advantage. Even in China, we are working closely in China as well. You may think that they have a lot of data, but if you look at cancer, for example, they say that each cancer type is a rare disease. They don't have enough data, genetic data, out of billion-plus people to cure cancer. So there's a need to collaborate. So no country can do it alone. And I think Africa does not have a time disadvantage, and it has the attitude, and it doesn't have the legacy of the third industrial revolution, so we can jump forward and really direct our resources towards that future.
Sylvia, we're talking about a future that you're already in. I mean, this is your world, you exist in it. Where does the potential lie for the continent?
It's quite in all industries, I can say. It's in health, it's in agriculture, transportation, and everything else. But then we have to be, as I mentioned earlier, the African governments have to be intentional. If the word should be protectionism of its people's data, then let it be, because data can be very beneficial and very fragile at the same time. Very volatile, where someone can use it against you. As you mentioned, we don't want it to be another curse for the continent, as oil has been for the longest time. So governments have to be intentional and make sure that we have the Africans owning their own data and using the data to solve their own problems.
Okay. Frans, I'd like to ask you the same question. Where do you think the highest area of opportunity is when it comes to big data in Africa?
So very much to what Murat was saying earlier, the field is brand new, right? No one has established themselves from a kind of different geography perspective as the leaders in this space. There is a wide set of opportunity for anyone to kind of tool up in that regard. And I think within the context of Africa, we have these centers of excellence, right? And to maybe kind of give a practical view upon that, one of the kind of main services out of Amazon's web services was built in Cape Town, right? So we have the talent and we've got these pockets of excellence. And if we can, through good policy, kind of good interaction with the academic community, develop this skills base and rather the capacity to do good data science in Africa, I think there's a big opportunity for Africa to almost step right forward into that environment, right?
And by the way, what's been your experience when it comes to skilled labor? Are we stepping up to the plate?
Absolutely. It's been great for us. We're predominantly kind of from employ our staff base out of the South African space, right? We find the tertiary educations work very well here. There's a lot of work going on the ground about just uplifting also from the high school level into the data science space. It's quite interesting just to see the different institutions busy just retooling and wrapping their mind around data science as a skill set.
I'd like to ask Sylvia the same question. What's your experience been working in East Africa when it comes to skilled laborers?
So for our team, it's generally made up of East African. We tend to call ourselves the East African community, and most of us have skills ranging from cybersecurity, data science, and from MIT, Carnegie Mellon, and currently Carnegie Mellon is based in Rwanda, and they're training and focusing on data science and all sorts of skill sets for the region. And they are training mostly the Africans in Africa to make sure that we solve our own problems.
All right, so Alex, we've been talking about this future in Africa. If the ideal happens and the infrastructure is set up, we have the policies, where is the money coming from?
Well, it's coming from the innovation and entrepreneurial spirit of a lot of folks that are not in this room. I mean, the idea is, and I'm an optimist at heart, if we get the data policy and regulatory framework right, if we get the commitment as a group and constituencies to real cross-border digital trade, if we commit to actually having a cybersecurity and raise our game approach as a continent and as a set of entities, government or private sector, I think that if you get the platform piece done, then all the innovation, the refining aspect of the oil equation, right? All these great applications in the food sector, the health sector, the public sector, the services sector. I think there's an opportunity for a wave of job creation and entrepreneurship, which is really exciting. I think, as you mentioned, I mean, it's still early days, and there's a lot of moving parts. And what I would ask all of us as committed and concerned folks around the development of Africa, pick up the urgency. The urgency is really critical here. It starts with awareness, and I think that's building. There has to be a sense of more paranoia, but then there's some specific concrete commitments on the policy side and nurturing the job creation piece. You know, we talked about the skills. In Asia, where I spent a fair amount of time in the 1990s, I saw a lot of parallels. Right, all this opportunity, skill, but there was much more a focus on education at the STEM science levels, and I think that needs to be picked up. That's another ingredient we didn't talk about as much, you know, sort of the core educational skills development to be able to enable the entrepreneurship, to enable the data and analytics startups and new businesses out there. And some of them are great ideas. I wish I could invest in some of them already, but there's a lot to do. And you got to be realistic about that, and we have to pick up our game as a collection and as individual companies and entities.
Do you think Africa is ready?
It's getting ready. I can't speak for Africa. I'm concerned that, or I would be concerned that you have such a complex, Africa is not one country, right? It's not one cohort. There's so many issues and the like. But getting ready is the game. And I believe in the underlying fundamentals of the economies and the people. But there needs to be some very specific interventions on the data policy side.
Murat, you have another fascinating idea, which is beyond capitalizing on data AI for aid. What is that about?
Yeah, so we were talking to Japanese government. The concept of a marketplace is something we're implementing in Japan because it's a necessity for them. And then we talked about countries who lack data and how do we support them. And right now, if you look at a lot of aid or aid for developing countries, it's in the form of infrastructure. And we thought, why don't we create data as an aid mechanism and open up a country's data set? Maybe Japan can open up their data to other countries so that they can benefit from the use of their data and develop machine learning solutions for the benefit of their citizens and small, medium enterprises. So think of it as artificial intelligence for aid. As the countries are developing their data infrastructures, which we think they should, but some countries may not be as big as Nigeria or Kenya or South Africa. They may not have the data. And so what do we do as a global community? Do we leave them forever behind? So we developed this idea of AI for aid and opening up data pools for these countries to be able to use in their own economies. So it's a concept. It's gotten a lot of support from a number of countries, including Japan and India. And as we lay the infrastructure for this data marketplace concept, we can open up their data pools for specific purposes for other countries. And I think we can deliver aid much faster than traditional infrastructure projects. And there's a lot of support for that.
Okay, Sylvia, how does this sound to you? Is this a concept that you would buy into?
I feel like fighting with Murat, but it's fine.
That's all right.
It's a concept that is really necessary if at all those countries own their own data. And as Frans said, we have to develop our own, the AWSs of this world, in Africa for Africans. Otherwise, our data will never be in the continent forever. So it's a good idea as long as that data is based in the African continent and controlled by the Africans.
Could you potentially see Africa being the one to deliver the data aid as opposed to receiving it?
If the training is focused on the African continent by having the skill transfer to the Africans who will be able at least to drive this idea, then I feel like it will be a very good thing to look at.
So we agree. Good.
We agree.
Okay, we have 2 minutes left, and I just want to ask my panelists to, all of you just tell me what you think the future is for Africa when it comes to data and what we can do to harness the power of that. We'll start with you, Alex, and we'll work our way to Sylvia.
Well, I mean, as I said at the beginning, I think there's two parts of the brain that you have to keep in balance. One is the opportunity side. I think it's early days in terms of the implications of the fourth industrial revolution. I think there's some great leapfrog applications for Africa in all the sectors that are relevant, small and medium innovation, the rural sector, making that more productive, the fintech sector. It's already an area which has a high mobile payments penetration, but how do you extend that to the female and underrepresented populations in all of the economic potential of Africa? So I'm very optimistic on the applications of data analysis, targeting it against certain applications, doing great things for all the groups of society. And on the paranoia and urgency side, I think there are sensible things, policy steps to move forward there that are not impossible to achieve if there's commitment.
Frans?
So, I mean, I think kind of almost doubling down on the opportunity that exists to participate in data science at a global level. There's this great space that can open up to Africa from a job opportunity, right? An employment opportunity where we participate within Africa, but also globally, and that takes a bit of a kind of focus within the context of training up for data science. But that space exists now, right? And I think kind of in the future, if we drive towards that environment, we can do a lot of work towards kind of bringing Africa forward and leapfrogging a lot within the context of data science. Right. It's kind of talking to the point on the mobile networks. Africa, from that perspective, I'd like to think kind of leads a lot of the thinking around mobile banking.
Yeah.
It's just because we've naturally stepped straight into the mobile network space as opposed to the copper space. Right?
All right, let me get to Murat and Sylvia because we're running out of time.
There's no role model for this. It hasn't been done before. And I think it's time for Africa to act now. If we don't, it may be too late. So the opportunity is there, and I share Alex's sense of urgency to get going. Sylvia.
I would say a lot of intentional thinking around this and skills development to make sure that the African continent, especially the African governments, are focused on making sure that the problems they need to solve are thought about intentionally using data.
Thank you very much to the panel. Thank you to the audience right here. And of course, to those of you who are watching us from home and online. Thank you for tuning in.